I'm going to ask the first question, and then we have a bunch of other questions that are coming into the chat. So I want to give you, a chance to respond to them. I was really struck this time about how many Democrats in the end voted for that $850 billion. And, I know when you call their offices, they say they voted for these amendments, they vote for the amendments, they know they're going to fail, but in the end they're voting almost, I think only 38 Democrats voted against it. And I actually looked, I realized that I had a misimpression. I went back and looked at the vote for the NDAA the year before. And even there as well, the Democrats basically collapsed. And I am wondering whether, you think that collapse, how you explain that collapse. Is that because Joe Biden's the president and so you do more or less what the White House wants? Is it because of these lobbies? Is it different now? And again, back to China and Russia. In other words, is that also now providing the framework for members of Congress to basically endorse a hawk approach? I mean, just as a small item, I'm struck with Nancy Pelosi's, idea that she's going to go to Taiwan. Like, why are you doing that? Like, what's that about? How helpful is that? Right. So I guess I'm really asking you, what your thoughts are on the Democrats' collapse on this issue, or you think it's always been this way?
I think it's worse this year than it's been in a while. I think partly Democrats don't want to vote against Biden. I think that's probably part of it because they feel like he's already on thin ice. There's kind of a bureaucratic reason or a kind of a political reason that it often happens, which is sort of as you suggested. They can say, well, I voted for this amendment, this critical amendment, and then they vote for the final bill. And I think they're covering themselves because there's still this fear that they're going to be targeted as soft on defense. So I think that plays a role. And of course, the industry throwing money at them, the plants in their districts, and the notion that they're, they want to show they're tough on China and Russia. So I think they all kind of converge. And so you have some principled members, people like Ro Khanna and others who will stand firm and vote against the final bill. But a lot of them just kind of run for cover. And I think, the vote on stopping that 37 billion was 152 against doing it. But, considering there's 435 members of Congress, that's still not a very strong showing. So we have a long way to go. But I think certainly people should pressure Democrats about why they're doing this kind of thing, because I think a lot of times they, just given the alternative, that they kind of get away with doing this kind of stuff without the kind of pressure that they deserve to have.
How do you interpret the statements by Putin seeking to gain a change in the world order, plus their open alliance with China in the light of the increased budget? How do you propose practical diplomacy working when Putin has openly chosen war to alter the international political structure?
Well, I think part of it is a question of power. Putin may want to change the international political structure, but he doesn't have the power to do it. He obviously has the power to cause great suffering in Ukraine, which he's doing in a very vicious fashion as we speak. I think, diplomacy for Ukraine is not an easy matter, but there's got to at least be some feelers put out about how this might come about, as opposed to allowing this to become a long grinding war that goes on for 2, 5, 10 years or more. And things people have talked about are neutrality for Ukraine with security guarantees, how to deal with the territory that, roll back anything Russia's gained in this invasion, and then have a political solution to the other territorial issues. And in the light of this, some promise of reducing some of the sanctions in exchange for Russian participation. I think the question is right. Putin is not ready for diplomacy at the moment. I think he's not shown any interests at this particular moment. The only small glimmer of hope was the agreement over grain, if it holds, allowing grain to be exported. So it's a difficult issue, and unlike some other issues that we work on, the U.S. government doesn't have as much power as, for example, we could stop our government arming Saudi Arabia tomorrow and force them to the peace table in Yemen. If we get our government to take a diplomatic approach in Yemen and stop just pouring weapons in without kind of thinking of the longer term consequences, even if the Biden administration had a better position, was more engaged in a diplomatic strategy, that doesn't mean that Putin would immediately jump to attention and say, "Oh yes, I'm ready to negotiate." So it's more a question of getting our government to be as constructive as possible, to not throw fuel on the fire, and then try to work for a better outcome than an endless war, which the people of Ukraine will pay the greatest price for, of course. So it's a difficult problem, but I think our current approach has the danger of making matters worse rather than better.
And do you know if the Biden administration ever invites friendly opposing views to present their positions before they make decisions? And if so, who are those voices? If not, how can one encourage that?
They'll sometimes have meetings with representatives of think tanks. They tend to lean towards mainstream or conservative think tanks. Occasionally, I'll get invited to one of these things, or somebody from a progressive organization, but usually there'll be a dozen or 15 or 20 mainstream think tanks, and then a token couple of critics. And sometimes the discussions are more in the manner of the administration telling us what a great job they're doing and us not getting a lot of input. But they do informally consult, probably a wider range of experts and interests, but they're really, at the moment, I think the Hawks have the upper hand in terms of who they're listening to, and in terms of their own key players. Secretary of State Blinken hasn't even talked to the Russian foreign minister since the start of the war. And even if you oppose it, which of course we must, and you would still want to keep some sort of channels of communication open, which hasn't been happening, at least at that level. So, yeah, I think they need to be more open to other points of view. I think the only way to do that is to be public pressure for them to listen to a broader range of views. Members of Congress can weigh in with them, try to open the door for other viewpoints. But it's a difficult moment for doing that, but I think it's worth the effort to keep trying to get at least other ideas in the mix as they're considering policy going forward.
What if Trump is able to obtain the White House again in 2024? How would that affect the situation you described, since he has openly said he would withdraw from NATO?
Well, Trump on foreign policy is a strange duck. My concern about Trump is if he gets elected, we might not have a democracy left. And so that reason alone is reason to try to make sure that doesn't happen. But on foreign policy, he's a strange mix. He's an isolationist. He's an angry toddler. He's all over the map. So for example, he was going to have talks with the North Korean leader Kim Jong-un to deal with the nuclear issue. And then when those fell through and didn't accomplish anything, he started making statements about how North Korea would see fire and fury like they'd never seen before. So making, nuclear threats. He has, threatened to leave NATO. But on the other hand, even as he was cozying up to Putin, they were also sending arms to Ukraine. They were also taking a tough stance on some other issues. He didn't accomplish anything on nuclear arms control because he was busy blustering. He did sort of set the stage for getting out of Afghanistan, which Biden followed through on, to his credit. So I think a Trump presidency on foreign policy, well, it would be high risk, I think, because having him in control of the nuclear button, I think, is a nightmare. But in terms of what he might do about troop deployments or how he dealt with allies, or he'd probably cause a lot of damage in terms of U.S. diplomatic relations with other countries. But would he put troops on the ground? Would he have his interventionary policy? Very hard to know. But I think all the other negative consequences of him coming to power sort of, overwhelm anything that might occur in terms of, not intervening in this or that conflict.
Do you support a change in the world security order? And if so, what would that change look like? Would the change include NATO, or should NATO be dismantled?
I think over time, NATO should be dissolved, and there should be a security arrangement that involves all of Europe, that involves Russia. There was a possibility of this at the end of the Cold War, which was a missed opportunity. And this moment today, you're not going to get a lot of traction talking about dismantling NATO. But I think ultimately there's got to be an overarching security arrangement that's more about dialogue and security assurances and arms control and disarmament than it is about massing troops and arms racing and all the things we have now. I think also the United Nations needs to have a stronger role, which probably means reforming the Security Council so that every single important initiative can't be vetoed by one of the great powers. But I think the UN, even in its current state of where it's limited by the great powers, can play an important role as an interlocutor in negotiations. The UN helped bring a truce for the moment to the war in Yemen. They helped negotiate the deal that we're hoping will allow grain to be exported out of Ukraine to the rest of the world. So I think a stronger emphasis and a strengthening and reforming of the UN, more overarching security arrangements that include potential adversaries as well as traditional allies. I think things like the nuclear ban treaty should be pursued vigorously. And then I think we need different economic arrangements because a lot of the conflict in the world has to do with economic deprivation, with corruption of various regimes, as well as other political and cultural factors. So I think if we could sort of build up towards that kind of world, that would be the way to go. I think the going after NATO is a longer term proposition, just because of the moment we're in and the media landscape and the politics that we're faced with. But I think ultimately that should be a goal.
Coming back to advocating on these issues with members of Congress, the actions of politicians, including Nancy Pelosi, seem to be focused on politics / the next election. So how do we get around that to focus on rational / logical / principled foreign policy?
Well, I think we need more people in the discussion. I think that a lot of the leadership takes a very narrow view of who their constituents are. Of course, there's their donors. There's people who vote in high proportions, which tend to be higher income people. There's not as much looking at what about all the people who don't vote? What would it take to bring them into the mix? And that's what people like the Poor People's Campaign are working very hard on to try to change that equation. But even a relatively small number of constituents can sometimes turn around a member. I was at some demonstrations at Elliot Engel's office back when he was still in office, and he was running House Foreign Affairs. And he had been a friend of the Saudi regime and others in the Gulf. But these demonstrations were about stopping arming the Saudis as leverage to end the war in Yemen. And there were only about 10 of us. We talked to his political guy and his press guy, and we recruited some people from his district to go talk to him. There were some Yemeni business owners from the Yemeni diaspora who also weighed in with him. And over a matter of months, he switched sides, voted for resolutions to stop U.S. military support for Saudi Arabia, spoke at the annual meeting of Action Corps, which was one of the leading local organizations lobbying to end the war in Yemen. So it's not always going to be that easy. And he was also looking over his shoulder that he was going to have a primary, and ultimately he was defeated. But I think a combination of, if there's other voices out there, if they feel that there's a political cost to business as usual, we have a better chance of turning them around. But if they think they can just appeal to a small kind of elite base, then I think they get away with a lot more of these things, like the Pelosi proposed trip to Taiwan, which is only going to exacerbate tensions between the U.S. and China, and ultimately it isn't even good for the people of Taiwan.
What do you make of the visit to Ukraine by Representatives Barbara Lee and other traditional peace advocates in Congress who declared solidarity with Ukraine in war against Russia?
I think solidarity is one thing, but supporting endless weapons sales and a military solution is another thing. And I think too many members are kind of conflating those two. It's interesting, you don't hear a lot of talk about the millions of refugees from Ukraine. How are they being taken care of? Who's going to put money in? Is the United States going to let significant numbers of refugees in? And if so, will it be part of a more generous policy for refugees from all the other war zones, many of which the U.S. is responsible for? So I think there's a lot of ways to show solidarity without signing on to a military agenda. But I think a lot of members have, they've kind of blurred that line. And I think that's unfortunate.
The Ukrainian invasion or the invasion of Ukraine has diverted some attention to the Middle East. What should we be prioritizing in Middle East dialogue? Was a question.
Well, I think as late as it is in the day, I think pressing the administration to try to revive the Iran nuclear deal is still well worth it. This administration has barely lifted a finger to move Israel, to roll back the occupation, to roll back the repression, to roll back even assassinations and murders by its security forces. So there's got to be a role for the United States to support Palestinian rights, and not simply sign off on anything the Israeli government at the moment wants to do. And this administration, it hasn't shown any interest in that, but it's got to be revived. I mean, the thing about Biden's trip is he tried to promote it as a peace overture because he thought he could get the Saudis to maybe normalize relations with Israel. But it was also an attempt to build a bloc against Iran, which would increase tensions with Iran, increase the possibilities of war there. And he completely neglected the Palestinian rights issue. So the two biggest possible causes of war in the region were either ignored or exacerbated in the name of this kind of, diplomatic sounding Abraham Accords, which of course were the brainchild of Donald Trump and Jared Kushner, not the best known peaceniks on the planet. So I think real pressure on Israel. I think pushing for the Iran nuclear deal. I think reversing course and stopping arming the Saudi regime until they agree to a comprehensive peace agreement in Yemen and stop their internal repression. I think there's many things that could be done, some of which Biden even promised to do and step back on. And I think a reduction of the U.S. military presence, which is still far too large, and it's still at those levels more likely to embroil the U.S. in further conflicts in the Middle East.
Yes, and we at Brooklyn for Peace have certainly been organizing on those issues in the past and continue to do so. So we invite folks to get involved with that. So Ukraine is organizing a 1 million person military, and all the NATO powers are committing themselves in various ways to this. There was talk after the February-March fighting of reinforcing Ukraine so it could overthrow Putin. What do you make of such open debates since this conflict has 4 nuclear powers involved? And the other question is there a role in pushing the media, if not to reframe the causes of the war, to call for more coverage about nuclear arms in general, as they play a much smaller role in the public conscious in the last 20 to 30 years?
Okay. So I think, any strategy that talks about trying to defeat Putin militarily raises the risks of a nuclear confrontation. And so I think that shouldn't be anything that governments or others are advocating for. But of course, you hear it much more often than we should. And likewise with the issue of Taiwan, U.S. should not be escalating rhetoric about Taiwan independence. It should stick to the one China policy that it's had for years. But members of Congress are putting forward legislative ideas and statements and travel plans and so forth that are increasing the risk of U.S.-China conflict. And the whole U.S. strategy towards China, the notion that there should be a strategy for defeating China in a war makes absolutely no sense, because a war between two nuclear armed powers would be a disaster, perhaps an unprecedented disaster. So in terms of getting the press to cover this more, there was a little bit of coverage when Putin was making the more vocal threats about the possibility of using nuclear weapons, just as there was kind of a moment of coverage when Trump used to make those kinds of threats. But I think somehow we need to break the issue open. And part of it, I think, is what happened with the nuclear ban treaty, which is more focused on the consequences of a nuclear war, the humanitarian consequences, and not just getting in debates about, throw weights and nuclear acronyms and nuclear deterrence. And, once you go down that road of debating nuclear weapons on the terms of the establishment, it's easy to get lost. And also it's easy to lose your ability to educate the public. So I think groups like the International Coalition to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, Physicians for Social Responsibility, which has been doing very good work on this, I think have kind of a way in, at least, to trying to change where we're at. And also, I think, other forms of culture. We did a program at Quincy about the anniversary of the day after the film in the 80s about the consequences of a nuclear war, which reached millions and millions of people. Of course, it wouldn't have existed without the nuclear freeze movement, without kind of a major upsurge of public organizing about nuclear weapons created the possibility that a major network would run such a program. But I think, any levers we have, political, cultural, pressing the media directly to do better coverage, I think also supporting independent media like Democracy Now! And Truth Out and others to reach bigger audiences. I think it's kind of we have to work on parallel tracks. We have to push the mainstream media to be better, and we have to get the independent media, help them get bigger audiences.
Well, thank you so much, Bill. I think you've given us some really key insights on military spending, why the budget has grown so much in this particular instance, as well as opportunities for addressing this from the grassroots. So we really appreciate you being here and sharing this with us. So I think we're kind of ready to wrap up. I don't know if there's anything final that's on your mind that you want to share.
Well, I just want to thank everybody for being here and thank Brooklyn for Peace for all the great work you're doing. I think what you do is harder than what I do. I mean, being an organizer is tough work. And I think, we're in tough times to do that work, but I'm inspired partly because there's groups like Brooklyn's for Peace that, are willing to take on these issues and educate the public about it. And I think there's a lot more work to be done, but there's a lot of good work happening already. And I don't think we should downplay that. So
thank you. And I think we're in this together.
Yes,
so.
Exactly.
So I think just to kind of highlight a couple of actions that people can take right now or anytime. As Bill explained, we have this excessively bloated National Defense Authorization Act that recently passed the House, and it will be going to the Senate for them to come up with their version of it and vote on it. And so what folks can do now is call their senators and urge them to vote for any amendments to the NDAA that would make top line cuts to the budget, and vote against any final NDAA that doesn't make those cuts. So we need to be really pushing hard for cutting those funds and redirecting them towards investing in human needs. And the second key action that folks can take is Representative Jayapal is leading a congressional sign-on letter to President Biden, urging him to support proactive diplomacy in pursuit of a negotiated settlement to Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine. And so this is the first real concrete call for a diplomatic solution to the crisis in Ukraine that we've seen from Congress. So we really encourage people to contact your representatives and ask them to sign on to that letter. Please also let us know, get in touch with us if you're interested in working on any of these issues with Brooklyn for Peace further, organizing around reducing military spending or ending the war in Ukraine. And I put our email in the chat so you can get in touch with us directly. And we also invite you to sign up for our newsletter to keep up to date with our activities. And I'll put the link for that in the chat as well. And so that concludes our program. So thank you again, everyone, for joining, and we hope you all have a good evening.
Thank you.